Welcome to our weekly Torah class. Today is a very special portion. I think I begin with those words just about every week, saying today is a very special portion. Because truly every week is a very special portion, and this week is a very special portion. This week we are discussing the Torah portion of Yitro. The Torah portion of Yitro is named after Moses' father-in-law, but the crux of the portion, or the majority of the portion of that which is discussed in this week's Torah portion is indeed the giving of the 10 Commandments, which is a seismic moment in the history of the Jewish people. It defines us, it continues to define us, but more than the 10 Commandments, there was an entire experience that the Jewish people went through at the time of the giving of the 10 Commandments, the Sinai experience. And it didn't happen in 5 minutes. It happened over a week of time. They had to get ready. And there was a tremendous pomp and circumstance. And truly, the way the Torah describes the giving of the 10 Commandments, it was an earth-shattering experience in the sense that it was really with great wonder, lightning and thunder. And if we can just imagine the scene, the Torah tells us that there were 600,000 men of military age at the giving of Mount Sinai. Of those men between the ages of 20 and 60, we assume that they have each a wife and perhaps a couple of children. We do the math and we see that the number of people that are traveling in the desert is not a ragtag number of a small group of people who had escaped Egyptian slavery. It's a huge nation. It's the Jewish people as a huge nation, and they come together at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they have this really immense metaphysical, spiritual experience wherein they witness a tremendous amount of natural phenomenon that is unusual. The Torah tells us that before the giving of Mount Sinai, the world became very, very still. Think of a tsunami and how the world becomes very still before a tsunami. And then through the giving of the 10 Commandments, it was with great lightning and thunder. And so it was so intense that the way the Medrash puts it, that the Jewish people were actually seeing the thunder and hearing the lightning. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, to see thunder or hear lightning, because physically speaking, in the realm of what we know as physics, that doesn't happen. But it means that there was so much energy there that they were able to perceive it in a way that overtook them. So much so that the Medrash tells us that this experience was so overwhelming for the Jewish people that they passed out from it. And after hearing the first commandment or the first 2 commandments, they begged Moses to tell God to stop. And they asked Moses, you teach us, we can hear it from you. This is too much for us. So Moses teaches the rest of the 10 Commandments. So it's definitely something that is experienced as a collective. And indeed, Maimonides, in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, when he talks about Hilchos Deos, he talks about the laws of knowing. He says that one of the responsibilities that Jews have is to know God. And the epicenter of knowing God, of understanding God, begins at Sinai. And Maimonides says that we were all there, historically speaking. The four people of the Jewish people were there at Sinai, and they had this collective Jewish experience. It wasn't a single prophet that went to a mountaintop. It wasn't a group of prophets that had a vision in the desert. We're talking about a collective nation that as one received the Torah. And in fact, the Torah tells us in this week's Torah portion, Vayichan Yisrael neged hahar, that and Israel camped facing the mountain. And Rashi says about those words, Vayichan Yisrael neged hahar, Rashi says Vayichan is conjugated in the singular. And it really should say Vayichanu, and they camped towards facing the mountain. But instead the Torah says Vayichan, and he camped. And Rashi notes this anomaly. And Rashi says, how is this that the Torah is mentioning the entire Jewish people as a single person. And Rashi says there, Ki ish echad belev echad. They were like one man with one heart. They were one collective. They were really united. This was a unique time in the history of the Jewish people. Rashi says that after that, though this was a time of great unity, after that it was always with tremendous amount of squabbles and dissent. And it's interesting to note because, the famous joke that says that you have, if you have two Jews, you're going to have three opinions. Or as people say, they belong to several synagogues. The one that they go to sometimes, the one that they go to less often, and the one that they won't step foot in. So there's this idea of being Jewish, and tension and strife and dissent is really part and parcel of the Jewish experience. Jews are an opinionated people. We are the people of the book. We are the people of discussion. We are the people that, debate. That to be a Jew is to really be engaged in what is truth, and so on and so forth. Yet, at one point in our history, and Rashi says it was at this point in our history, at the point of the giving of the Torah, that actually the Jewish people were, for a moment in time, united, like one man and one heart, a collective united together in peace and harmony and unity and kindness and togetherness and everything else that we wish upon ourselves. We say every day in our prayers, we say, Oseh shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu va'al kol Yisrael v'naimar amen, or v'imru amen. He who makes peace on high between all the energies of the upper worlds, should he make peace on all of us and on all of Israel. Because to have peace, to be as one community at one time, collective, in a positive way, not in a negative way. Remember that in our history, when we have been persecuted, there's nothing like a little bit of anti-Semitism that gets us all bandied together and to collect together and speak out in one voice and say, this is not okay. We come together when we're persecuted, but to come together with a universal idea, to come together with a universal truth, with a universal sense of cohesion, of something that is positive in our sphere as Jews, is very unique. And our sages tell us it happened at that time in Matan Torah. And the truth of the matter is that any conflict that we have, if it is a conflict that is rooted in true seeking of the Torah, the Mishnah tells us, Kol machlekes shehi shem shemayim sefer liskayim. Any dissent, any argument, any kind of discussion that we'll have where we disagree with each other, if it is really for a higher purpose, l'shem shemayim, for the purpose of really understanding God's will, as it were, it will turn out to be, it will endure, it will turn out to be positive. And so really the definition of what is unity and what is togetherness is really set down in this week's Torah portion, that unity and togetherness can only come for us as a Jewish people when we seek to be connected to God, when we seek to be connected to an eternal truth. Otherwise, we're just a bunch of rabble-rousers, problematic people who are really stiff-necked, like the Torah says, and really opinionated. But if we take that opinionated approach, and we really strive to understand what is God, what is God's truth, that is the one umbrella that has brought us together one time in history at the giving of the Torah, and that is the umbrella that can bring us together for all time. So today we're going to discuss the 10 Commandments and what happens in the 10 Commandments, how they are given, what are the 10 Commandments, and the preamble to the 10 Commandments, and how this plays out in the history of the Jewish people. So if you just give me a moment here. Okay, so let me just go back to this. Okay, if you just give me a moment here, and let's get into the text. So the Torah tells us when the Torah was given. The Jewish people left Egypt. And 3 months after they left Egypt, on the first day of the third month, they settled near this mountain at Sinai, and here begins the preparation for the receiving of the Torah. A few days before they receive the Torah, man and wife have to separate. They can't have intimacy. They can't have intercourse. They have to prepare themselves emotionally, spiritually. They have to get psyched up to get ready to receive the Torah. And there's this waiting that happens. And finally, Moses goes down to the mountain, goes up to the mountain, and he comes down with the teachings of the Ten Commandments. And as I said, we're told that the Ten Commandments are given to the Jewish people. The first two are heard through this divine voice, and after that they cannot handle it, and Moses teaches the rest. Now, we're going to get into the Ten Commandments. As you know, that the Ten Commandments were presented on 2 tablets, and there are 5 commandments on one side of the tablets, and there are another 5 on the other side of the tablets, right? And the first 5 are what we call mitzvat shebein adam lemakom, which means these are mitzvahs or commandments that are delegated to the area of man and his creator, man and God. And the second part is mitzvahs shebein adam lechavero. These are the commandments that are dealing with people and humanity. So in other words, spiritual commandments or religious commandments on one side, and then civil law, as it were, or civil infrastructure on the other side. Now, it's interesting to note, a lot of people do not know, outside of the Jewish tradition, that the Jewish people actually don't have just 10 commandments, so we have 613. We have 613 commandments. Of those commandments, a great deal of those commandments are not applicable to us. First and foremost, because many of the commandments that we have as part of the 613 commandments are commandments that are only applicable for the Jewish people if there is a temple in Jerusalem. Otherwise, they don't apply. And there's a slew of them, of commandments that only apply to the Jewish people when there's a temple in Jerusalem. Also, there's a bunch of commandments that only apply to certain segments of the population. So for example, there are commandments that apply only to the Kohen or to the Levite. So there are a whole bunch of commandments that don't apply in today's day and age. And then there are commandments that don't apply to all people, to all times, and so on and so forth. So we get down to it, there's not that many commandments, there aren't 613, but there are certainly more than 10. And the trick is that people feel that, the 10, if I do the 10, I'm good. The other stuff is extra. The other stuff was added later. Where does the other stuff come from? There's a lot of confusion about where the 10 commandments come from and what happens with the other commandments that are so-called added commandments. The truth of the matter is that the Torah tells us that when God gave the 10 commandments to Moses, it was almost like 10 principles. And then after that, in the next ensuing 40 years that Moses spent with the Jewish people in the desert, he went on and explained the commandments at great length, and he deducted and taught. Remember that our tradition tells us that Moses, after the Jewish people heard the 10 commandments, Moses went up and he was on the mountaintop for 40 days and 40 nights studying Torah from God. And this is what he taught. He teaches the Jewish people throughout the 40 years. And that is the basis of all the commandments that we are going to learn as we start now. The seismic event of the giving of the 10 commandments, we're going to go through all the commandments that follow. So it is a misnomer to say that or a mistake to say that there's 10 commandments and then everything else was added. The 10 commandments are like the umbrella commandments that are like the founding principles, but it's understood that they are explained and enumerated, and there are many, many, many branches that follow afterwards. So less known also is that we have the concept that there were 7 commandments that were given universally to mankind, and this was given during Noah's time. 7 important universal laws for mankind. And these are 10 commandments for the Jewish people, And we can argue that it applies universally to all people. So really that is just a preamble of what the 10 Commandments are. They're not, the rest of the Torah is not added to the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments is like the glossary. It's the beginning. It's what we call Rosh Prakim. It's the beginning of the commandments that the Jewish people are taught. However, when we study the giving of the 10 Commandments, and when we study Sinai and we study the 10 Commandments themselves, we're going to see that there's a lot to be unraveled in those 10 Commandments. And that's what I would like to study with you today. So I'm going to share with you the story of, where is it? Let me just find this. I'm going to share with you one second. Okay, let me just find this. All right, here we go. I'm going to share with you the 10 Commandments as the Torah describes it. And we're going to analyze a couple of very fascinating teachings in this Sinai experience and in the 10 Commandments itself. So very simply, in this week's Torah section, after Moses meets his father-in-law, we start with the description of the Jewish people receiving the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. So the Torah tells us, "B'chodesh hashlishi l'tzeis b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim b'yom hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai." So it was on the third day when the Jewish people left Egypt. On this day, they came to the area that we know as the Sinai Desert. Now, Rashi brings a teaching from the Mechilta, as you see here highlighted. And Rashi says there's an anomaly here. He asked the question, what does it mean to say that the Jewish people arrived from the land of Egypt on this day? Shouldn't it have said on that day? Because the Torah is talking in past tense. The Torah is telling us that in the past, the Jewish people arrived to this desert. So why does the Torah use the language of the present tense? Bayom hazeh, on this day. Okay, here it is on the English. So Rashi says, Bayom hazeh, on this day. Which day was this? Rosh Chodesh Sivan, so the third day of the month of Sivan. And Rashi brings up a question. He says as follows, Lai haya tzarech l'chtov ela bayom hahu. The proper way, the proper grammatical way would have been to write bayom hahu, on that day. On that day, they came to the Sinai Desert. Mahu bayom hazeh. Why does it say on this day? It's not on this day, it's on that day. We're talking in past tense. So Rashi says this is to teach us an important lesson. Sheyiyu divrei Torah chadashim alecha ki'ilu hayom nisanu. That the words of the Torah shall be new to you as if they were given just today. So what seemingly is an anomaly, to say something in the present tense, that the Torah was given to us on this day, instead of saying the Torah was given to us on that day, Rashi tells us, he quotes the Mechilta, that the reason for this is to teach us an important lesson, that the Torah is given to us today. Today, meaning that it should be relevant to us today, meaning that there could be a tendency to say, this happened a very long time ago, and what relevance does it have to me? And therefore, the idea of being fresh and relevant is an important concept in the giving of the Torah. And the truth of the matter is that when we kind of accept the Torah every single day anew, we're refreshed and we're able to connect to it in a most beautiful way. And as I mentioned before, that the Torah is the one positive unifying factor of the Jewish people. There are other unifying factors of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, a tremendous unifying factor for the Jewish people is when we are persecuted. That kind of brings us all together. All our differences fall apart because we're threatened as a people. But when it comes to a positive unifying factor, there are so many different ways of doing things, but at least trying to connect to Torah, is the one that can really unite us. So here comes a secondary teaching that also is something that needs to be, I think, celebrated, explored, and talked about. And what is this? Verse 3, Moshe Allah el Elokim, and Moses went up to God. Vayikrav Elov Hashem minahar lemar, and God called to him, saying, now you notice I'm not mentioning God's name in vain because I'm not reading the Torah in order. Lemar, he said as follows, Ko Tomar Leves Yaakov, so shall you say to the house of Jacob, Visagid Livnei Yisrael, and you shall tell to the children of Israel. So this is what the Torah tells us. You shall say, so shall you say to the house of Jacob and to the children of Israel. What is it? What is that you should say? And the Torah is going to be explained and taught. So Rashi notes the anomaly. First of all, why does the Torah use a double language when saying he spoke to the Jewish people? Is this a form of poetry? Ko somar lebeis Yaakov, so shall you say to the house of Jacob, and tell to the sons of Israel. Why the double language? So ko samar, Rashi says about the words ko samar, b'lashon hazeh, or keseder hazeh, with this language and with this order. He cites the Mechilta. What is this language and this order? That means that first you should teach the house of Jacob, and then you shall teach the house of Israel. What is the house of Jacob? Rashi explains. The house of Jacob, says Rashi, Elo Hanashim, these are the women. And how should you teach it to them? Tomar lahem b'lashon raka, you should teach it to them in a gentle language. V'sagid livnei Yisrael, and teach it to the children of Israel. And here Rashi says, what are we talking about when we talk about the children of Israel? So Rashi says, Einshin, the punishments for violating of the Torah, Viduktin, and all the tiny details and precepts, Perish lezacharim or Parash lezacharim, teach to the males. And then Rashi says, so there are two groups of people that you're going to teach. Veis Yaakov, the house of Jacob, this refers to the women folk. How should you teach it to them? In this order, first the women, and then the men. And then how should you teach the women? In a gentle tone. How should you teach the men? Outline for them all the punishments and all the details that they're responsible to know and do. And Rashi brings the teaching of the Mechilta that says, why does the Torah use the word visagid? It says, ko somar, so shall you say. So shall you say, right? Ko somar, so shall you say. Why can't it say, ko somar lebeis Yaakov, so shall you say to the house of Jacob, the ko somar livnei Yisrael, and so shall you say to the house of Israel. So this is what you should say to the women folk, this is what you should say to the men folk. But rather, the Torah uses another word for saying, and the word that the Torah uses is tagid. You should say. And Rashi says, again, quoting the Mechilta in Shabbos, Rashi says, why does it say tagid, using the words tagid? Rashi says, because this shares the etymology of gidin, okay? It has the same etymology of gidin. What are gidin? Gidin, according to some, are wormwood, according to others, are sinews, depending on the translation that are found. Suffice it is to say that what the Torah is telling the Jewish people is that the Jewish women should be taught the Torah first, the men second, the women should be taught gently and in generalities, and the men should be taught in a more severe language. So I just want to take a moment to discuss that before we get into the rest of the Ten Commandments and the saying of the Ten Commandments. This is a fascinating teaching. And then there's a great discussion amongst the sages about why is this? Why does God teach insist to Moshe that he should teach the women first, teach the women the Torah first, and then go on to teach the men. And why do the women get spoken to in a gentle fashion and the men get spoken to in a more harsh fashion? So there's a lot of discussion about this in the commentators and the mystics. And the consensus is as follows. Women need to be taught the Torah first, or need to know the Torah first before even the men do. Why? Because the woman is going to determine how much the Torah is going to be respected in her family. So that if a woman is completely ignorant of Torah, how can she pass along to her children a love of Torah, an excitement for Torah, a passion for Torah? And some commentators, I think the Medrash says, well, look what happened in the Garden of Eden. God gave the commandment to Adam, he didn't give it to Eve, and it all got messed up. So if you want something done properly, first make sure the women are on board. And if the women are on board, then you will know that the men will be on board as well. Now, in our personal experiences, in our own lives, isn't it true that what we value, what we really value, what we put the greatest emphasis on is what our children will pick up. So it is fundamental and instrumental that Jewish women are on board, so to speak, with knowing the Torah, because without them, there is no point B. There is no step two. If the men and only the men will know the Torah and the women won't know the Torah, it doesn't get transmitted very well. Now, there was a time that the Torah was taught more in a less organized fashion. So, for example, most women, for the past, let's say, 2,000 years, I would say, until really, I would say, until mandatory education started in Western societies. So before mandatory education, especially mandatory education for women or for girls, started, most girls learned Torah from her mother and her grandmother. She was at home, and as she grew up, she was taught everything as it related to her. So she was taught how to read from her mother, taught her how to read, and then her mother would teach her the Torah portion, and her mother had learned it from her mother, and so on and so forth. It was an oral tradition that was passed on from women, and the men studied it formally in the yeshiva, but there was an oral tradition that was passed on from woman to woman to woman to woman in the home. And so the Torah tells us, Shma beni musar avicha, listen, my son, to the reprimand of your father, va'al titosh Torahs imecha, and do not forget the Torah of your mother. And in fact, this kind of oral tradition of Torah is referred to in our sages, in the writings. They refer to this as Dat Yehudit, which literally means the religion of the Jewish woman, or the teaching of the Jewish woman. And the Dat Yehudit is part and parcel of what it means, of what it meant to be a Jew. So let's say everything that was a Jewish woman. So anything that had to do with being a Jewish woman was taught in the home. Now, when mandatory secular education became part and parcel of Western society, and girls were no longer home all day with their mothers, that connection was severed, and that connection was lost. And so we have, for the first time, a situation where the men or the young men are going to yeshiva and they're studying Torah, and the women are going to public school, and they don't have that same time and benefit and relationship to learn from their mother. And that connection, that Dat Yehudit, which was going on for generation upon generation upon generation, is severed. And suddenly we have a whole generation. We're not talking now, I'm talking about 100 years ago, in Europe, a whole generation of Jewish women that are no longer spending the majority of their day with their mother, no longer getting this kind of Jewish education by osmosis, and they're severed from Torah knowledge. And this becomes a crisis for the Jewish community. And so eventually what happens is that there's an understanding that just like the women are getting a formal secular education, they have to get a formal Jewish education, not for the sake of competing with the boys or keeping up with the boys, because I think when it comes to Torah study, girls are much more passionate than boys are. It was really so that they should have that Dat Yehudi, they should have that Jewish feminine transmission that was lost, that they should be educated Jews, because you cannot be a Torah observant Jew if you're an ignorant Jew, because you just don't know, and you could be doing things, you may want to do things correctly, but you don't know how to do it. So this begins the genesis of formal Jewish education for girls. It's because it's lost in the home. But for thousands of years, it was passed on from mother to daughter. And it starts, not now, it's not, people say, oh, it's a new concept that Jewish women are taught, finally Jewish women are being emancipated, they're getting an education. No, the Torah's perspective on Jewish women knowing Torah goes back 3,300 years plus, when actually the Torah tells us that Moses was instructed that before he even teaches the men, he should teach the women. In other words, when the Torah was taught in the aftermath of the giving of the 10 Commandments, the women were part and parcel of the teachings. They did not receive the same education. There was more of a concern, and the fact that the Torah tells us, Sagi, that the men should be taught with the severity of Torah. In other words, knowing the fallout that will happen if you violate Torah. This is because there's a certain energy that the Torah recognizes in males that needs to be tempered and directed into a positive way, where the Torah is not seemingly so concerned with the feminine population. But I think this is such an important teaching. This is obviously a women's Torah class. And that some people feel the idea of women studying Torah is a brand new idea, and it's an innovation and something brand new. And it's great because women should study Torah. They should be open and should be allowed to study Torah. But the truth of the matter is that if we go back to our sages, we see that the idea of teaching Jewish women Torah comes all the way back from the oral tradition. We're going back thousands of years on the Mechilta that says this idea that women were taught Torah is part and parcel of our tradition going back 3,300 years plus, and that not only that women were taught Torah, but that God directed Moses to make sure that the women were on board. Now, remember that when Pharaoh wanted to take the Jews out of Egypt, or let the Jews go out of Egypt, he allowed the men to go first, and Moses repeatedly said to him, no, it is not enough that the men leave Egypt, but we have to go b'narenu, v'skinenu, b'vnaisenu. We have to go with our sons and our daughters and our elders, with all of us. In other words, our girls and our boys are part and parcel of the Sinai experience. And the Torah tells us that when it came to receiving the Torah at Sinai, men and women and children equally were there to receive the Torah. The Torah is not in the purview of scholars. The Torah is not in the purview of the righteous, or the tzaddikim, or the great people, or the great scholars. The Torah is in the purview of each and every single person that is part of the Jewish people. In other words, whether you are part of the Jewish people because you become part of the Jewish people through choice, like Moses' father-in-law does in this week's Torah portion, or whether you become part and parcel of the Jewish people through birth or whatever, the birthright, that is your right. The Torah is your right. It belongs to all of you. And one of the bylines that I have used for many years when I shared my Torah class is that this class is dedicated obviously to women studying Torah through the feminine lens, is that the Torah is yours too. Often women think that the Torah was given like to the men, and now lately it's an idea that women should study Torah. But if we look into the teachings of our sages, we see that from the very beginning, women being part and parcel of the Jewish experience, and indeed of knowing Torah, is fundamental to Judaism. It's not an innovation. It is true that throughout the years, the men studied specifically the men studied the Talmud, and the men studied the laws and the exegesis of the laws and the manifestations and the different types of arguments. And women were not studying this so much. And the reason for this is very simple, because in the study of the Talmud and in the study of all the arguments, it is always staying in the area of the theoretical. It's not practical. So for all the years that the Jewish women were running our homes, and through all the years of the generations of Jewish womanhood, it wasn't practical to start studying but if you do this and then if you do that, because there was a reality on hand. It's called survival. But today, when women have opportunities to study even the theoretical, even the non-applicable theoretical teachings that we all are purview to, physics or whatever other things that we may not use in our own lives, for the sake of intellectual curiosity, because we have that capacity now to be open to that. So the Rebbe says, the Lubavitch Rebbe said that because women today have the luxury to study anything that they are intellectually curious about, they have a responsibility to study the Torah as well. It is inconceivable that a woman should be knowledgeable in everything else, in any science, in any school of thought, and not be equally as knowledgeable in Torah. The reason why women were not necessarily enmeshed in the Talmudic argument, because it wasn't applicable. In other words, a lot of Talmudic argument goes to theory. The halacha, the Jewish law, is found in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law. If you study it, you know how to be a Jew. How the law was derived and what was the arguments regarding the law really was not applicable, and most women were not interested in how it came to be. They just wanted to know, as a Jewish woman, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my family? What do I have to know? But today we have that leisure, so therefore we have also the obligation to engage that leisure in the theoretical of Torah. So really an important lesson as we study the Sinai experience, to know that the preamble to the Sinai experience was the inclusion of women, and not only the inclusion of women, but the setting of the women first in the study of Torah. Moses was commanded first the women, Kosamar leVeis Yaakov v'Sagid leBnei Yisrael, and as Rashi says, the Lashon Hazeh, Kiseger Hazeh, this language in this order, meaning women first, or as we say, ladies first. So this is really an important teaching that all women have to know, that it's not an innovation that Torah belongs to women. This is part and parcel of our tradition, going back to Moses, all the way back. And now that we have the ability, and we have the intellectual capacity, we have the leisure to have intellectual curiosity, we are able to really study anything today. We have the mandate and the obligation to be as knowledgeable in everything that pertains to our Jewish tradition as we do to any other science or area of knowledge. So that's an important lesson for all of us. And so that's something we can all celebrate here, that this is what we do here. We study the Torah and we study it as women. And this is really part and parcel of our tradition and what God wants us to do. This is the way God wanted it to be, that women should know. And the truth of the matter is that the Torah, our passion for Torah is something that we can share with people around us, and we have a tremendous impact in our environment. And so I think this is an important preamble to the Ten Commandments. Now we're going to get into the first of the 10 Commandments.
I'm sorry, can I stop you for a second? Sure. What is the Mechilta?
Mechilta is part of the Medrash. The Medrash is part of the oral tradition. So we're talking circa, it's part of you could say it's an addendum to the Talmud. The Talmud, by and large, deals with ethical teachings, the Pirkei Avot, and then mostly legalistic teachings. So for example, my husband and my son have a chavruta, and right now, what are they studying? They're studying currencies and what happens when currencies are traded, the value of currencies, the fluctuations, and when people exchange currencies, we're talking about very, very specific forms of knowledge. In fact, if you study Talmud, you'll encounter physics, you'll encounter math, you'll encounter biology, ecology. Everything is kind of touched in it. So the Talmud is very legalistic, by and large. There are some sections of the Talmud where the Talmud will discuss things that are kind of off on the side, which is very fascinating of itself. That's part of the Talmud I find the most interesting, actually. The legalistic stuff, I personally don't have such an interest in it necessarily, but then there are different teachings that come apart, that are part of the oral tradition. So circa Talmud, that are not legalistic in nature. They are more what we call drush, or the word for drush I'm looking for is
explanation.
Yeah, explanation, exegesis. The part of Torah that is not, let's say, legal in nature. So the extra legal teachings that the Torah has is found often in the Mechilta, in the Medrash. So these are all part of the oral tradition, circa the Talmud. So it has the same, I guess, weight as the Talmud does. And Rashi often will refer to the Mechilta. Now Rashi, the role of Rashi in teaching Torah, Rashi states his role very, very clearly. Rashi says about himself, he says this in several places. He says, "Ba'ani laibasi ella lifaresh pshuta shel mikra." I have come only to teach the very simple meaning of the text, meaning that Rashi sees himself almost as a dictionary. In other words, Rashi says, what does this mean? What does this word mean? Because we're talking about an oral tradition, right? So what does this word mean? I'll give you an example of a word that could be very puzzling. For example, the Torah tells us that we should put totafot b'nei necha. You should put, we say that in the Shema. We should put totofet b'nei necha. You should put these thing called totofot between your eyes. And then there's a question: is what is totofot? No one really knows. So the phylacteries. What is phylacteries? So the oral tradition will be telling us that totofot are these square boxes that have in it the Shema, and it's placed on the forehead and across the heart, on the left arm, and so on and so forth. So a lot of times it's simple explanation. Rashi says, I'm here just to give you the simple explanation. Rashi will note an anomaly, being that he was really what we call a baki. He was an expert in the entire Torah, and he was an expert in the entire Talmud as well. When he sees in the Tanakh as well, Rashi's commentary on the Tanakh, when Rashi sees, knowing the language of the Talmud, knowing the language of the Torah, knowing the language of the 5 books of Moses, and being very intricately familiar with it, when Rashi sees an anomaly, Rashi will note it and find a reason for it. He'll say, what is this? Why does it say this? This is not in the style of the Chumash. There's something to be taught, there's something to be learned here. And he will go and find where the rabbis have expounded on this, and he will look for the most rational teaching. So often, Rashi is really looking for the most sensible, rational teaching, and he is very well versed with all of Talmud and the oral tradition, including the Medrash and the Mechilta. And he will say, the most rational thing that I can come up with is this teaching from the Mechilta, which is part of the oral tradition. So when we talk about what Rashi is teaching, historically, when we talk about teaching the oral tradition, when we talk about the Jewish people having a tradition, learning Rashi with a Chumash is almost like having a translation. It is impossible to really study Chumash without Rashi, because Rashi was the one who actually went through the entire 5 books of Moses and the 24 books of the Tanakh and the entire Talmud, and is so well versed with the language and notes any anomaly in the language, and therefore comes just to teach us what it means. And Rashi says this, Ani basi ella lefarish pshuto shel mikra, which means I've come to teach the most basic meaning of the text. I'm not here to teach allegory. I'm not here to teach, exegesis. I'm not here to teach depth of learning. I'm not here to teach the Kabbalah. I'm here to teach the basic meaning of the verse. And so Rashi tries to find the most rational reason for this anomaly. Now, I just want to say as a side that in general, when the Talmud discusses the Torah, there are 13 principles of deduction that the Talmud uses to deduct law, to deduct teachings. There are 13 principles, and that's the juxtaposition of two verses, the repetition of language. There are 13 principles that the Talmud uses to deduct the oral tradition. And Rashi is also in use of those 13 principles, and Rashi uses them. So it's not willy-nilly. It's really a principled, it's a formula. It's a formula of study that is what the Talmud is based on, which is the 13 principles of the Torah tells us, the Talmud tells us, B'shlosha esrei midos haTorah nidreshes, where 13 principles the Torah is expounded, and those 13 principles are applied to Torah study. And this is what Rashi gives to us in a very simple way. And Rashi says, in his humility, Rashi says, I'm here only to bring up a question that a 5-year-old child would ask when he studied the text. Rashi says, I came here to bring the question of the 5-year-old. In other words, in his humility, he says that, because obviously so much of Rashi teaches is profound and deep. But his point, the purpose of the Torah study that Rashi brings to the table is really to just make sense of the Torah in a very simple fashion, without great detail, without great analogies or mysteries, just what is the pure meaning of the text. And that's really what Rashi sets out to do. And as I mentioned, he says, I want to bring up the questions that a 5-year-old will ask. And actually, you should know that one of the great teachings and the great contributions of the Lubavitcher Rebbe to Torah was that the Rebbe would analyze Rashis. So this is not an analysis of Rashi. This is a very simple Rashi that we just studied. But the Rebbe would analyze Rashi, why Rashi would teach a certain thing in a certain way, why he used his language. The Rebbe was one of the great analysts of Rashi. I think in the history of Torah study, the Rebbe's contribution to Rashi studies is on the books for one of the greatest analysis of Rashi ever. And I know that often the Rebbe would turn to the audience when he was teaching this, and for Farbrengen, he would say, so what's the question that Rashi, what's bothering Rashi here? And the Rebbe would say, Nu, is there a 5-year-old who can tell us? Is there a 5-year-old who can tell us? And sometimes the Rebbe would point to a small child and say, Rashi is speaking to you. What's your question? Now, it's very interesting that sometimes a 5-year-old will have a question that a 50-year-old will not have. Why? Because we kind of take things as they come. Children will say, but why? But why? But why? They pick up on an anomaly that we may say is not an anomaly. We'll say, oh, well, maybe it was meant to be that way. So it's very interesting that Rebbe would do that sometimes in his talks. He would say, is there a 5-year-old that has, that can note the anomaly? And the Rebbe would sometimes look at the 5-year-olds who would come to the Farbrengens with their fathers and say, what's the anomaly? So the truth is that Rashi is coming to teach a very simple meaning. And the fact that this is such a simple Rashi makes it part and parcel of Jewish tradition. Rashi, of course, lived 1,000 years ago, way before the women's rights movement, and the Mechilta is circa the time of the Talmud, so we're talking 2,000 years ago. So this is part and parcel of the teaching for the Jewish people for a very long time. And we have a tradition that the tradition of the Mechilta and the tradition of the Talmud is based on an oral tradition that was passed on teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student. And again, mentioning Maimonides, in his opening of his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides has a section called Hilchos Deah, the laws of knowledge. And in there, Maimonides actually goes through the chain of student to teacher, student to teacher, student to teacher, all the way back to Moses. So part and parcel of the oral tradition is not that the oral tradition pops up 2,000 years ago, circa the destruction of the temple, but rather Maimonides, who is the ultimate scientist and the rationalist, will trace back the sages of the Talmud to the teacher who taught them, to the teacher who taught them, and the teacher who taught them, and so on and so forth. And he actually enumerates this in his introduction to his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah. And so this is really part and parcel of the oral tradition, is that there is a chain of command, there's a transmission. So when we say the Mechilta says something, we're really saying that the oral tradition, going back to Moses, from the early teachings, have taught this. So it's part and parcel of our tradition. Now, a little bit into the Ten Commandments, but as time will permit us,
Sorry.
it's actually, you should know that, I think that I thank you for the question, Charlotte, because it's an important teaching to unravel. And there's so much misconception about how the sages come to certain teachings, that it is important to study how this happened. And you see that from, rather than just saying, oh, that's our faith, that's what we believe. The Torah is the language of Torah. Torah means hora'ah, to teach. Moses is not called Moses. Moses is not known as Moses, our prophet. He is the preeminent prophet of the Jewish people. That is true. We see Moses as our prophet. But what do we call Moses? We don't call him Moshe HaNavi. We say Eliyahu HaNavi, Elijah the prophet. But what do we say about Moses? What's his moniker? We say Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. Because the relationship that we have to Moses is one who taught us. And the relationship that we have to Torah is something that teaches us. And that the teaching and the transmission of the teaching is recorded, it's accounted, and it's not just, myths or teachings that we believe in. And it is very enlightening to study Maimonides, because Maimonides really is a scientist. His approach to everything that he teaches is an approach of science. And Maimonides is probably, of all the sages in the Talmud, of all the sages in history, Maimonides is one of the great rationalists. He seeks to understand, the idea without the mysticism. There are sages like Nachmanides, who is a great mystic and leans often to the side of mysticism and sees things more from a mystical perspective. Maimonides sees things from a very practical, scientific perspective. So Maimonides is the great rationalist. So when Maimonides tells us that there is a chain of command, and he lists every single teacher going all the way back, because it's recorded, we see that there's a science to this Torah. It is definitely a Torah of faith, but there's a science, and there's a methodology, a very clear methodology. And there's a method to it, and what we deduct and how we keep the Torah is definitely based on that. That being said,
Sorry.
yes.
Maimonides, when did he live?
Maimonides lived about 800 years ago.
So Rashi was 1,000 years ago, and Maimonides was 800 years ago.
Yes. So Maimonides is later than Rashi. Yeah, later. Maimonides, 1100s, I think. I would have to look up the exact date of his.
Just to put it in perspective.
Yeah, somewhere around there. But Maimonides is the great codifier, and his approach is really, he's a great rationalist. And I'll give you an example of Maimonides' rationalization. When it comes to certain things, like, for example, when it comes to an area of, let's say, family life, so intimacy, sexual, the attitude to sexuality. Maimonides takes a very pragmatic view. Don't be too sexually active, don't be too little, it should be healthy, it should be proper, it should be this. He takes a very like middle, like just a practical approach. And he could see a sexual drive as a negative, something that really can destroy a person. Nachmanides, who is this mystic, sees sexuality in the terms of very colorful terms, like that it brings unity between a man and a woman, that God rests upon the man and woman during intimacy, that there could be nothing in intimacy that is wrong, because God created every organ, including the sexual organ, and it's almost poetic the way Nachmanides will see things. He'll see things in a very poetic fashion. Maimonides will see things in a very pragmatic fashion. You see this throughout the commentators. Nachmanides will say this was an angel. Maimonides will say it's not an angel. It was a human being who they thought was an angel. So there you see this difference. What comes down to the bottom of things is that Maimonides is the ultimate pragmatist, the ultimate rationalist. So when he gives a teaching, we can divorce it from mysticism and all the beautiful ideas that the Torah has in the oral tradition, all these beautiful mystical ideas which make the Torah so rich. But when Maimonides notes something, it is really the most scientific, rational idea. And so Maimonides does give the chain of command. You could study it in the laws of the introduction to Maimonides' book of the Mishnah Torah, as it's called, or the Yad HaChazaka, and it's fascinating. And Maimonides goes through great lengths to explain the oral tradition and how the oral tradition is transmitted. And Maimonides says that the oral tradition, including the Mechilta and everything that we discuss here, is so part and parcel of Judaism that one cannot be Jewish without it. One cannot understand Judaism without it. To negate it is to negate Judaism itself. That is the teaching of Maimonides, the rationalist. So it is very important to know that we do believe that with the 10 Commandments, which we did not get into today, but we shall get into eventually, because we're going to read the 10 Commandments again in a couple parshiot when Moses repeats the giving of the 10 Commandments. But in the giving of the 10 Commandments, there is with it this oral tradition. And to be a Jew today is to believe that it cannot be separated. So says Maimonides, that God forbid, Maimonides says, one can separate the written from the oral. To separate it is to deny the written itself. So that's something that we probably could study another time, these great teachings of Maimonides regarding the oral tradition. But suffice it is to say that the oral tradition is intertwined, and it is both a science and also a heritage. In other words, it's something that was taught father to son, teacher to student, and there also is a science to it. So at one point it could not make sense, but there's a way to deduct things. In fact, I'm just going to conclude with this story. I think it's an important aspect. I didn't mean to get so far into the idea of the oral tradition with the 10 Commandments, but I think it's an important aspect of it. I want to conclude with a story. There's a story that's told with one of the great sages. I think his name was Rabbi Eliezer, that they were all discussing the Talmud. They were discussing a law, and the sages in the time of the Talmud, they have these principles, like I mentioned, the 13 principles of deduction, and they apply the principles to Torah law. But sometimes, even within those 13 principles, there could have been a difference of opinion. In that case, when there was a difference of opinion, they ruled by majority. In other words, how most of the people understood the Torah. So there's a famous story that's told by one of the sages of the Talmud, that he was a genius, a young man, and he ruled differently than the sages about, I think, the kashrut of an oven, if the oven had to be broken or if it could be kept. And the sages disagreed with him. So he had a group of sages, the majority disagreed with him, and he said, no, I know that the law is the way I understand it. And the sages disagreed, and he said, if the law is the way I understand it, then the river that flows near our house of study should flow backwards. And what happened? The river flew backwards. And he said, you see? And they're like, we're not impressed. Then he said, if the law is the way I have studied it, then the walls should shake or cave. And the walls started to shake or cave. And the rabbi said, we're not impressed. And finally, he said, if the law is the way I have studied it, says Rabbi Eliezer, then God, heaven itself should come and testify on my behalf. And suddenly they heard a voice with the Talmud tells us it was a bas call. It was a low voice that said, the Torah is taught, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. Eliezer understands the halacha. At which point, all the sages turned to Rabbi Eliezer and to this voice, so to speak, and they said, HaTorah lo b'shamayim. The Torah is no longer in heaven. It was given to us. We have a tradition. We have principles of deduction. And you know what? That is how the Torah is studied. In other words, at one point, the system of the way the Torah is studied has to be recognized as holy as the Torah itself. Even though Rabbi Eliezer had all the mystical forces behind him, the river running the wrong way, the walls of the study hall shaking or caving in, and even a heavenly voice appearing. And they're like, yep, but there is a way, there's a method to this madness. We have a tradition, we follow the tradition, and the system itself has to be supported. And that is really why we are still practicing Torah in the same fashion that we have for all these years, because we follow the system. Once we start understanding Torah the way we understand it, and we negate things as individuals without this broad framework of the scholarship of all these years, then we end up having a different Torah indeed. So really, we're so blessed and so privileged that we're studying the same Torah. 3,000 years ago, we're studying the same Torah, and we can understand it. Of course, we can apply it differently today than we can to what we learned before. But I just want to conclude with this beautiful thought that one of the great teachings that we have is that immediately following the exodus of Egypt, the Torah was given to the Jewish people. Look at many slaves that were emancipated, whether it was in the United States or in other cultures. Slaves that were emancipated and were not given the framework to live through what, let's say, a kind of constitution, really became paralyzed by the freedom and unable in a certain way to break out of the slavery. But what God did to the Jewish people was, when he took us out of Egypt, he said in the Ten Commandments, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God, that took you out of Egypt, and you shall have no other gods before me. And once that was said, no other gods means no other slave masters, no other forces, no other powers that be rule you. The only one who should ever rule you is the spirit of the divine. And if you live your life that way, if you live through that truth and that teaching, then no man can ever rule you, no society can ever subjugate you, because you are living with a higher purpose and with a higher purpose and a divine purpose, and then you are really only then really truly free. So the greatest gift that we have is the giving of the Ten Commandments and the giving of the Torah. Without it, we are lost as a people. And just to bring it back to the beginning, that was the only time that we were ever united. The only time we were united as one people in one heart is when we were ready to receive the Torah. And it's the only thing that could really unite us again in a positive way. Of course, we can be united through negativity, that, for the forces of those who are anti-Semitic or the forces of those who are hateful. But isn't it so much better? Isn't it so much better to be united for something positive? The fact that we have a divine constitution that calls upon us to live a higher lifestyle and to live to our higher being, to speak to our higher self. And that is the most liberating thing of all. That's the greatest gift that we have as a people. And it's a gift that we need to share with the world. So if you have any questions.
That was really beautiful. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm just confused about one thing. I understood the Mishnah and the Gemara is the Talmud, which is the oral law.
Right.
Now I've heard, I don't know I didn't understand exactly what the Mechilta is. Is that the Midrash?
Mechilta is part of the Medrash, yes, and the Medrash is part of the oral tradition, and it is also when we talk about where does it appear in the timeline of the Jewish history, it is around the time of the Talmud, and you could say that it is like an addendum to the Talmud. The parts that are not legalistic, the parts that are extra legal, so things that inform us in a more mystical sense. Mm-hmm. Some part of the Medrash, you see, there's some Medrash that is very, very allegorical, and we know that even the rabbis and the Talmud tell us that some of the Medrash that were taught, yes, right, it's an allegory. We're not supposed to take it literally. And that is part and parcel of that beautiful tradition, that there are parts of the Medrash that are allegories or have deep messages within it, right? Or we'll have some strange stories in the Talmud that don't make sense rationally. So there's a kind of, they're allegories. So that
when you read it, how would you know the difference?
Right. So how would you know the difference? So I would say that if Rashi cites it, that would, for me, make a very big difference, because Rashi, again, comes to teach us not the allegory. Rashi says over and over again, I have come only to teach the simple meaning of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. So if Rashi cites it, it's a teaching that is just a rational teaching. And if we find it just in the Medrash, it could not. I'll give you an example of a Medrash that has that is clearly allegorical, but when you study it, you see there's great depth in the allegory. For example, it says that when Moses was floating on the river, Pharaoh's daughter, Batya, came to get him, and she couldn't reach. So she stretched out her hand, and when she stretched out her hand, she was able to reach him. The Medrash on those words, and she stretched out her hand and she couldn't, and she was able to stretch, says that she couldn't stretch her hand so far, she couldn't reach him. And God, miraculously, as it were, stretched her hand out much further than she was able to naturally, and she was able to reach the little basket floating on the Nile. Now, the Torah tells us that God does not break nature usually. When nature is broken, it causes a tremendous amount of turmoil in the world. The laws of physics are the laws that God assigned to nature. So the laws of physics are not meant to be broken. It's not meant to be. So then the question is, so what happened? Did her hand stretch very, very far? Did it suddenly magically become very long? Or is the Medrash giving us an allegory for something much deeper, which is her hand, she went to get the baby and she did more than she was able to do physically. There was an impetus that she had that she wouldn't have had naturally. So for example, we know that this is recorded, that God forbid if someone's pinned under a car and people are really trying to save the person, that the adrenaline of even people who don't have physical capacity can lift the car and remove a person who's pinned under a car. And if you ask them afterwards, how did you pick up, an item of such weight? They won't have any rational explanation for why they were able to go and lift a car and unpin someone who's stuck under a car. What happens there? The adrenaline rushes in, whatever it is, gives a person momentarily superhuman powers, and they're able to do something that they otherwise would not be able to do and are probably never able to replicate again. And this is true. You find sometimes people are superhuman in ways they save someone who's drowning, and they don't even know how they have the energy to do it. That maybe there are people who are not so strong physically. So we know that this idea that someone can want to do something and somehow do something that is outside of what is their nature, what they can do, what is their capacity to do for a number of reasons, and they're able to do it. So you could study them. You could study the Medrash and say, this is such nonsense. This is magical stories, and the Torah is ridiculous. And unfortunately, often children are taught the story. They're never taught any deeper explanations. They go through life. They get more mature, and they go, I was taught such nonsense in Hebrew school. It's all a bunch of stories. But when you look at that Medrash, what the Medrash is telling you is that Batya did something extraordinary. She was able to break through a point that her arm by nature could not reach there. So was it because her arm physically could not reach there and she suddenly felt that she had superhuman strength to get this baby? She saved him in a way that she herself was surprised by her adrenaline? Was it because she broke through everything she knew, but that she was as the daughter of Pharaoh to save a Jewish child? We don't know, but we know that that story is rich with meaning. And that is an example of a Medrash that we don't have to take literally, but even if we don't take it literally, the story doesn't take away from the story. If I tell you that she magically got that child, and I tell you someone magically lifted someone from under a 1-ton car, it's the same idea. It's breaking through your nature in a way that you could never replicate afterwards, and you don't even understand how it happened at the time. So the question is, what is the Medrash? The Medrash is giving you an allegory. So in this case, the Talmud says, not all Medrashim are meant to be taken literally. There's another medrash that's told that there was a rabbi who was stranded on an island, and then finally he found out that the island was not really an island. He was sitting on a whale that was moving. Again, rabbis will say, is there such a thing? Can there be an island that is really the back of a whale? What is the meaning of this? Sometimes you think that you're on safe ground, and suddenly your safe ground actually turns out to be a fish that is not safe at all. It's a moving target. And so the rabbis will say that the medrash is not to be taken literally, but there are certain midrashim, and certainly those that are found in the Mechilta, especially when they're just trying to understand the meaning of the verse. There's nothing fantastical about it. And especially when they're analyzing the verse. So you're talking about an anomaly in the verse. You're talking about a repetition that doesn't make sense. Two different types of language that doesn't make sense. And the fact that Beis Yaakov is used before, previously, as the house of Jacob, meaning the women. This is found earlier in the book of Bereshit. So we have a teaching already before that Beis Yaakov is the house of women. And that's why, by the way, many girls' schools will be called Beit Yaakov. They're not named after a man named Yaakov. They are called Beit Yaakov because Beit Yaakov means the house of women. The house of Jacob is the house of women. The house of Israel is the fighter. Jacob is the nurturer. So we see the two elements of Jewish life is the nurturer element, the women, the fighter is Yisrael. So again, this is obviously, it takes a lot of study of the styles of the Medrash and the styles of the different teachings of the rabbis to know the difference. But I would posit and say that if Rashi brings it as a teaching, we are to understand it in the plain sense and not to understand it as some kind of allegory, because Rashi says over and over again, I'm here just to teach the very plain meaning of the verse. And again, it is his great scholarship, his phenomenal scholarship of the entire Torah, 5 books of Moses, 24 books of Tanakh, all of Talmud and Medrash and Mishnah that makes him this is why you will not find a Chumash printed without a Rashi commentary. It's almost impossible to have a Chumash without a Rashi commentary. It's considered part and parcel. And I would say this, that just as to add this, that, people ask me sometimes, learning about Jewish mysticism or learning about different things, we have to have a certain humility when we study Torah. And that we're talking about something that's studied for thousands of years by great scholars. And there's a science to it. And that in the same vein that we would not feel that if we opened up a medical journal, if we weren't trained in medicine, or if we opened up a medical textbook, that we would really be fully understanding, everything that we read in a way that would say, well, this is nonsense. I disagree with this. We could be curious about things. We could do more research. I'm not saying that someone who's not a doctor can't understand medical literature. I'm fascinated by medical literature. So I'm always reading everything I can in medicine. But I have the humility to say I have no medical training, so that if I don't understand something, I'm not going to make a pronouncement. And I think that's true too. That not everyone is, has the same level of knowledge, and even not every rabbi has the same level of knowledge. There are people we call poskim. They are people that are so well versed in every single part of Torah because they've studied it since the age of, let's say, 10. And that's all they studied from morning to night. And they're in their 80s and they're still studying it. When they're approached with a problem and they can, say on page 51 in the Talmud on this thing, it discusses this without, we have these great Torah scholars. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, he was they called him the Posek Hador. He was the person who everyone turned to for the bottom line in Jewish law. Why? Because he studied Torah day and night. He knew it all from the back of his hand. So when you came to him with a question, if there are Siamese twins, and if we separate them, there's a chance that both will die. Should we do the surgery? He can go back and tell you, halachically speaking, what has to be done. And he can cite you chapter, verse, why, yes, you should or not, and how it applies to today's day and age. And this is what we call a posek. So not every rabbi is a posek, not every rabbi is a rav. Not every Torah scholar is knowledgeable in every area of Torah. There are some Torah scholars that are very knowledgeable in certain elements of Torah, the laws of Shabbat. Some are very knowledgeable in the laws of divorce. Some are very knowledgeable in the laws of kashrut. Some are very knowledgeable in the text of the Talmud. Some are knowledgeable in the text of the Torah. it takes a lifetime to a lifetime of being taught and learning. And we can't just say I read this and then therefore it doesn't make any sense to me. And I see this with in my own life. Let's say, for example, my boys, who Talmud is a very big part of the Jewish their curriculum. When you talk about someone who's studying Talmud from, I would say 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night, day after day, year after year, from the age of 15, you're talking about someone who is very well versed and really enmeshed and understanding it. So there are different ways of knowing Torah. We can know it superficially, what we call bikiot. We know it in a superficial way, and then we can know it in a deeper way. So we always have to go back to the way Moses applied the Torah. If you look at Moses, what does the Torah tell us about Moses? Moshe ish anav mikol al pnei adama. Moses was the most humble of all people. Here he was, the repository of all this knowledge of the Jewish people, the most wise, the most knowledgeable, the one who God gave the Torah to teach to the Jewish people, and he was the most humble of all. And so you're talking about the prerequisite to Torah study. There's actually the Mishnah gives 48 qualities that you have to have in order to become a true Torah scholar. And perseverance, humility. There's so much that we need to do in order to get there. So we study, and we want to know, and we want to learn. And the more we learn, the more we're able to share with others, and so on and so forth. So definitely, if there's a take-home message of this week's Torah portion, is that as women, let's keep studying Torah. The Torah is part and parcel of what it means to be a Jew. It is our roadmap to life. And like I said, the questions that will come to a rabbi, can you do a surgery on Siamese twins, is found in Torah. Everything is found in Torah. As I mentioned many times, the Talmud says this, hafachba v'hafachba dekulaba. Turn its pages, everything is in it. So let's keep studying. Let's keep getting together. Let's get inspired. And knowledge is power, and knowledge is beauty. And Torah knowledge is also, besides being power and beauty, Torah knowledge is unity. And that's what the Torah tells us, that it is the one thing that truly unites us in a positive way. So let's keep doing it, and let's grow from it. And may it be something that inspires our lives and inspires those around us. And women have a tremendous capacity to inspire people around them, and that we have to tap into that energy that we have. And I think that it was no mistake that God wanted that the Jewish women should be taught before even the men, because really we are the guarantors of the tradition, and it's a big responsibility. It seemingly doesn't seem that way. It seems that it's all the big teachers and the rabbis, but it's not. We are the mainstays of our homes. We are the ones who direct the traffic. We are the ones who really give the environment. We create the environment, and we create what's important. We create the tone, and we have so much power that way. And we have to tap into it and create a home that Torah is no stranger. Torah should be part and parcel of everything that we do. It is, as the Torah tells us, Kihem chayenu v'arach yameinu. Torah is our life and is the length of our days. It is the blessing in our lives, and we should always be grateful for this experience called Mount Sinai, and for the experience of really being elevated from a slave people to a people with a higher goal and a higher way of living. And I'll just end with this thing, that when I was studying the 10 Commandments in high school, I remember that every commandment that we studied took us months to do. So we're going to have to go back. We're going to have to revisit this, because we got to the preamble, we didn't get into it. We are going to do it again. In the book of Devarim, the 10 Commandments are again taught, and so we're going to do it again. But I think this preamble is so important. I think it's so important because without it, we don't have the basis to understanding what follows. So, so thank you for joining me today, and tap into that girl power. Keep studying Torah, and everything is in it, and we are blessed to have it.